Billionaire slaps an old lady. Seconds later, everything changes. The sound cracked through the glass atrium like a gunshot, sharp, humiliating, impossible to ignore. Conversations died mid-breath. Phones froze and raised hands. In the split second after the slap, time itself seemed to recoil, as if the building refused to accept what had just happened. The old woman staggered, not from the force alone but from the shock of it, her white curls trembling as the echo chased itself up the marble columns. Across from her, the billionaire's jaw was still clenched, his hand hovering in the air where it had landed, eyes blazing with a certainty that said he believed the world belonged to him and that it had just proven it again. Then the old woman straightened. Not slowly, not weakly. She planted her feet, lifted her chin, and looked at him with a gaze so calm, so devastatingly steady, that a ripple of unease ran through the crowd. Somewhere in the silence, a security radio crackled. Somewhere else, a child began to cry. And in that breathless pause, the billionaire felt something unfamiliar brush the edges of his confidence, an intuition, faint but undeniable, that he had just struck far more than flesh. He had struck a fuse. The atrium of Halcyon Tower was designed to intimidate. 40 meters of open space, glass walls that drank the daylight and reflected power back at anyone who entered. Executives loved it for that reason. Investors too. It reminded them where they stood beneath wealth that soared. That morning, the tower was hosting a charity summit, the kind that polished reputations while quietly brokering influence. Cameras hovered. Assistants whispered. Guards stood with hands folded, eyes scanning faces. The old woman didn't fit. She wore a violet cardigan, neatly pressed, and white trousers that spoke of practicality, not fashion. Her shoes were clean, sensible, unlabeled. She carried no entourage, no badge that announced importance. Yet she stood directly in front of Victor Halle, founder and CEO of Halle Dominion, a man whose net worth had recently crossed into the territory usually reserved for legends. He was mid-argument, voice low and dangerous, words sharpened by impatience. "I told you," Victor said, gesturing toward a velvet rope that separated donors from staff. "This area is restricted." The woman's voice was gentle when she replied, "I know where I'm allowed to be." Victor laughed, a quick, dismissive sound that drew smiles from a few sycophants nearby. "Clearly, you don't." She didn't move. Instead, she reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Her hands were steady. Too steady. "I was invited," she said, offering it to him. Victor didn't take it. He leaned closer, invading her space, lowering his voice so only those nearest could hear. "Do you have any idea who you're holding up?" "I have a very good idea," she said. That was when irritation tipped into rage. Victor's life had been a series of rooms that opened because he demanded they do so. Resistance, especially from someone like her, felt like an insult that needed correcting. He waved off the guards who had begun to edge forward. "Handle your people," he snapped at an assistant, eyes never leaving the woman's face. "I'm not staff," she said softly. He scoffed. "Then you're lost." She met his gaze. "No. I'm exactly where I need to be." The words landed wrong. The crowd sensed it, the subtle shift when a powerful man realizes he's not in control. Victor's nostrils flared. He raised his hand, intending only to scare her, to reassert dominance with a theatrical gesture that would send her scurrying. The slap was louder than he expected. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Phones came up in unison. The old woman reeled, glasses slipping, but she did not fall. Victor's satisfaction evaporated as quickly as it had formed. For the first time in decades he saw fear, not in her, but in the faces around him. Security surged forward. "Sir." "Back," Victor barked. "She assaulted me." The lie was reflexive, habitual, and for a heartbeat, It almost worked. Then the old woman lifted a hand not to strike back, but to stop the guards. "Please," she said, "let him finish." The guards hesitated. Victor frowned. "Finish what?" "Showing everyone who you really are," a murmur spread. The woman picked up her fallen glasses, wiped them with the edge of her cardigan, and placed them carefully back on her face. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright, alert, and utterly unafraid. "My name," she said, voice carrying effortlessly across the atrium, "is Eleanor Whitaker." Victor blinked. The name brushed something in his memory, an old article, a footnote he'd skimmed years ago. He shook it off. "I don't care who you are." "That's what you think," Eleanor replied. She unfolded the paper in her hand and held it up not for Victor, but for the cameras. "This summit," she continued, "exists because of a trust established 37 years ago. A trust that funds ethical oversight, worker protections, and legal review for corporations that apply." Victor's smile was thin. "You're confused. Holly Dominion funds half of that trust." "Yes," Eleanor said, "with money that isn't entirely yours." The room went very still. Victor laughed again, louder this time, but it rang hollow. "Security," he said, pointing. "Remove her." No one moved. A senior guard leaned in, whispering urgently. Victor shook him off. "I said remove her." Eleanor turned slightly, addressing the crowd. "Before you do anything," she said, "you might want to hear why I'm here." She reached into her pocket again and withdrew a small, metal key attached to a faded blue tag. Those closest saw Victor's face change, just a flicker, but enough. The key unlocked a memory he had buried deep. A cramped office, a woman with steel in her spine, a contract he'd signed with shaking hands when his empire was still a fragile dream. "That key," Eleanor said, "opens a safety deposit box at Northbridge Bank. Inside are documents that prove Holly Dominion's foundational patents were acquired through coercion and fraud." The whisper became a roar. Victor stepped back, heart hammering. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "Because I was there when you signed. I was there when you promised to do better." She looked at his hand, the same hand that had struck her. "And now," she added quietly, "everyone is here to see what you chose instead." Sirens wailed faintly outside, growing louder. News alerts buzzed. Victor's phone vibrated incessantly in his pocket. The world he controlled was shifting, gears grinding against one another, sparks flying. Eleanor Whitaker stood unbowed in the center of the atrium, an old woman no longer invisible, and Victor Hawley understood with sudden, bone-deep clarity that the slap had been the smallest mistake of his life. And the consequences were only beginning. The sirens outside Halcyon Tower did not belong to the police, at least not yet. They were news vans, security escorts, private response teams summoned by people who sensed blood in the water. Glass doors slid open and shut in nervous rhythms as aides whispered into earpieces and executives pretended not to stare. The atrium, once a cathedral to quiet power, had become a pressure chamber. Victor Hawley felt it closing in. His phone buzzed again. He didn't look. He couldn't afford to. The old woman Eleanor Whitaker stood no more than 3 meters away, holding that key as if it weighed nothing. But to Victor, it felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He knew the box. He knew what was inside. And he knew that if those documents saw daylight, Holly Dominion would not merely stumble, it would fracture. "You're bluffing," Victor said at last, pitching his voice so it carried confidence even as his pulse hammered in his ears. "If you had proof, you'd have used it years ago." Eleanor's lips curved into something that was not a smile. "I was waiting." "For what?" "For you." That unsettled him more than anything else. Victor prided himself on foresight. He bought futures, hedged risks, controlled narratives. Waiting was what small people did while powerful ones acted. Yet here she was, claiming patience as a weapon. The guards shifted uneasily. Their training told them to protect the principal, but something about the woman's authority quiet, unyielding short-circuited the usual calculus. Camera zoomed in. Somewhere above, the giant LED display that usually looped corporate platitudes flickered as technicians debated whether to cut the feed. Victor made a decision. "Clear the floor," he ordered. "Now." "No," Eleanor said, not raising her voice. He turned on her sharply. "You don't give orders here." "I do," she replied. "When the bylaws say I do." A murmur rippled. Victor's head snapped back. "What bylaws?" Eleanor reached into her cardigan once more and withdrew a thin, leather-bound booklet. She opened it with practiced ease. "The Trust Bylaws. Section 4, Subsection C, Emergency Oversight Authority." Victor's mouth went dry. That section was repealed. "No," Eleanor said. "It was challenged and upheld, quietly." He laughed again, but this time it cracked. "By who?" "By me." Silence fell like a held breath. Eleanor looked around the atrium, making eye contact with the people who mattered, the journalists, the junior partners, the silent board observers who had come to network and now found themselves witnesses to history. 37 years ago, she said, I was appointed interim trustee of a small fund designed to ensure ethical compliance in emerging tech firms. One of those firms was a struggling startup run by a very ambitious young man. Victor's jaw tightened. He had ideas, Eleanor continued. Brilliant ones. He also had debts, investors circling like vultures, and a fear of failure that made him flexible. That's enough, Victor snapped. You're trespassing. Eleanor ignored him. He brought me a folder. Inside were patents, some his, some not. He wanted the fund's backing. I told him no. He begged. He threatened. Finally, he agreed to terms. Full transparency, worker protections, and a clause that allowed the trust to reclaim control if those terms were violated. She held up the key again. That clause was never removed. Victor's phone vibrated again. This time, he glanced at it. 12 missed calls. 3 from his general counsel. 2 from board members. 1 from a number he didn't recognize, but the country code made his stomach drop. Eleanor saw the look. They're calling because they're afraid, she said. They should be. You think you can destroy me with paperwork? Victor said. I'll bury you in litigation. Perhaps, Eleanor said. But not today. She turned to the nearest camera. I have already transferred copies of the documents to independent auditors. They are time-stamped, verified, and protected. Victor lunged forward, hand outstretched. You did what? Security moved instantly, not to stop Eleanor, but to restrain Victor. Hands closed around his arms. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. A billionaire being held back like an unruly guest was not a sight anyone expected to see. Let go of me, Victor shouted. Sir, the head of security said quietly, we need to de-escalate. Victor stared at him, incredulous. You work for me. I work for the building, the man replied, and for the law. Eleanor watched without triumph, only resolve. I didn't come here to humiliate you, she said. You did that yourself? I came because you crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. Victor laughed bitterly. You mean the slap? That's what this is about? You want an apology? The room seemed to lean in. Eleanor shook her head. No, the slap was merely convenient. She took a step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. I watched you for decades, Victor. I watched you cut corners, silence whistleblowers, and turn human beings into line items. I intervened when I could. I documented when I couldn't, and I waited for the moment when the mask would slip in public. She gestured subtly around them. Today, you gave me that moment. Victor's bravado collapsed inward, replaced by fury edged with fear. You think people care about ethics? He hissed. They care about profit. True, Eleanor said. Until profit becomes poison. A producer shouted from the edge of the crowd, Miss Whitaker, are you calling for Victor Hale's resignation? Eleanor turned. I'm calling for accountability. Another voice. Are you saying Hale Dominion was built on fraud? I'm saying, Eleanor replied carefully, that its foundation is compromised. Victor wrenched free from the guard's grip, straightening his suit with shaking hands. This is a setup, he announced loudly. A smear campaign by a disgruntled relic who wants relevance. Eleanor met his gaze. If that were true, she said, why are your lawyers calling? The LED screen flickered again, then switched on. Gasps erupted as a live feed appeared. A news anchor, eyes wide, speaking rapidly. Behind her, a headline scrolled in bold red letters. Hale Dominion stock halted amid fraud investigation. Victor stared at the screen as if it had struck him. No, he whispered. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was sadness there, not for him, but for what might have been. It's begun, she said. Outside, the sirens grew louder. Inside, Victor Hale's empire began to crack not with an explosion, but with a slow, unmistakable sound of something immense finally breaking under its own weight. And this time, there would be no slapping it away. The halt lasted exactly 17 minutes before the world began to tilt. Inside Halcyon Tower, the atrium transformed from spectacle to tribunal. Lawyers arrived, first sleek, grim, already dividing into factions. Then came auditors, then regulators, then the quiet men and women who never raised their voices because they never needed to. The building's temperature seemed to drop as power redistributed itself in real time. Victor Hale stood very still. For the first time in decades, he was not the axis around which the room rotated. Conversations curved away from him. Eyes slid past him. Assistants who once sprinted at the slightest flick of his fingers now pretended to be absorbed by tablets that no longer contained his calendar. Eleanor Whitaker had taken a seat. That alone unsettled him. She sat calmly on a bench near the reflecting pool, hands folded as if she were waiting for a delayed train rather than watching an empire unravel. The key lay on her palm, no longer a threat, just a fact. Victor approached her slowly. You planned this, he said. Yes. How long? Eleanor looked up at the ceiling, considering. Long enough to know you would react exactly as you did. He clenched his fists. You provoked me. No, she corrected gently. I removed the obstacles, Victor scoffed. You think a slap defines a man? No, Eleanor said. But it reveals him. Across the atrium, a junior board member, fresh-faced, ambitious, terrified, was arguing into a phone. Victor recognized the cadence. Damage control. The same dance he had led 1,000 times. But now the music was wrong. The steps no longer fit. A regulator approached Eleanor, badge discreet but unmistakable. Miss Whitaker, she said, we'll need to speak privately. Eleanor nodded and rose, joints creaking audibly. Victor watched her walk away with a strange, unwelcome sensation crawling up his spine. Fear, not of prison, not of fines, but of irrelevance. His phone finally rang. He answered without looking. Yes, he said. Victor, came the voice of his general counsel, brittle with strain. We have a problem. Victor laughed hollowly. You don't say. The trust documents are authentic. Worse, they're comprehensive. They reference shell entities we didn't even know existed. Victor's smile vanished. That's impossible. They predate your restructuring, the lawyer continued. Which means? They predate me, Victor finished quietly, silence on the line. Victor, the lawyer said carefully, There are signatures. Yours. From years you've claimed you were uninvolved. Victor closed his eyes. Memory stirred late nights, desperation, ink drying too fast, promises made to a woman he had assumed would fade into history. You told me those clauses were symbolic, Victor said. I believed it, the lawyer replied. But symbols have a way of becoming real. Victor ended the call. The LED screen shifted again. Analysts debated. Pundits speculated. Former employees' faces blurred, voices altered, began telling stories. Long hours, missing patents. Whistleblowers silenced by severance checks and threats wrapped in courtesy. Victor felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not panic, but a hollowness where certainty used to live. A memory surfaced unbidden. A younger Victor, standing in a cramped office, shaking Eleanor Whitaker's hand. She had looked him in the eye then, too. Had he noticed the steel beneath the kindness? Or had he mistaken patience for weakness, Mr. Hawley? He turned. A woman stood before him, mid-30s, sharp suit, sharper gaze. She extended a hand. My name is Clara Mendez, interim chair. He stared at her hand as if it were a foreign object. Interim? Effective immediately, she said. The board voted. Victor laughed once, incredulous. You can't do that without. Without you? Clara finished. We just did. Around them, phones buzzed in unison as the news broke. Victor Hawley steps aside amid investigation. The wording was polite. Temporary. A fiction everyone agreed to share. Victor lowered his voice. This is a mistake. Clara's expression softened, not with sympathy, but with professionalism. This is governance. He leaned closer. She's manipulating you. Clara followed his gaze to Eleanor, now speaking with regulators. Ms. Whitaker has been transparent, she said. That's more than I can say for everyone. Victor straightened, smoothing his suit out of habit. You'll regret this. Clara smiled faintly. We already regret not doing it sooner. Security approached again, not forceful this time, but firm. Sir, the lead said, we'll need you to step outside. Victor hesitated, scanning the room for allies. He found none. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. As he walked toward the doors, he passed Eleanor. She met his eyes one last time. You could have been great, she said quietly. He stopped. I am great. Eleanor shook her head. You were powerful. The doors opened. Cameras flashed. The outside world surged forward, hungry. Victor Hawley stepped into it alone. Inside, the building exhaled. Clara addressed the room, voice steady. We will cooperate fully, she said. We will audit every division. We will rebuild. A hand rose. And Ms. Whitaker? Eleanor turned, surprised. Clara smiled. We'd like you to stay. Eleanor looked around the atrium, the place she had once helped create, then spent decades watching from the shadows. She thought of the young man who had begged and bargained, of the empire that had grown crooked and tall. I'm very old, Eleanor said, and very tired. But not finished, Clara said. Eleanor considered the key in her palm. Then she closed her fingers around it, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Very well, she said, but on one condition. Clara leaned in. Name it. We do this in the light, Clara nodded. Agreed. High above, the LED screen changed once more. This time, the headline was different. Accountability begins. And somewhere, far from the glass and steel, Victor Hawley watched it all unfold on a screen he no longer controlled, realizing too late that the moment he had dismissed as nothing had been everything. The reckoning had only just begun. The morning after Victor Hale's removal, the city woke to a different skyline. Halcyon Tower still pierced the clouds, glass catching dawn like a blade, but something about it felt altered, less predatory, more exposed. The building no longer loomed as a monument to one man's will. It stood as evidence. Inside, the work began. Floors once sealed by biometric locks were opened. Vaults that had not been accessed in years were inventoried. Servers hummed under the weight of scrutiny as forensic teams mapped digital arteries that had quietly fed fortunes into shadows. Every hour brought a new revelation, and with each one, the myth of Victor Halle thinned. Eleanor Whitaker arrived early. She wore the same modest clothes as the day before, but her posture had changed, not straighter, calmer, as if the long-held tension in her shoulders had finally loosened. She walked the corridors with Clara Mendez, stopping often, listening more than speaking. "This department," Eleanor said softly at one point, gesturing to a cluster of cubicles, "was once meant to be the heart of innovation." Clara nodded. "Now it's mostly compliance." Eleanor smiled sadly. Power always claims it's temporary. At 10 sharp, the board convened. Not in the executive suite too symbolic, but in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. Transparency, Clara had insisted, literal and otherwise. Eleanor took a seat at the far end of the table. No title, no placard, just presence. The agenda was brutal: restitution funds, whistleblower protections, an independent ethics council with real teeth. A public apology, not the kind polished by lawyers, but one that admitted harm without hedging. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. "This will cost billions," one finally said. Eleanor looked at him. "So did the damage." Silence followed. Then, slowly, nods. Across town, Victor Halle sat in a penthouse that suddenly felt too large. Boxes littered the marble floor, papers hastily gathered, objects stripped of context. He had slept poorly, dreams fractured by flashes of the atrium, the slap, Eleanor's eyes. His phone buzzed again. Lawyers, former allies, reporters. He ignored them all and poured himself a drink he did not want. On the muted television, Clara Mendez stood at a podium. "We are not here to preserve a legacy," she said. "We are here to correct a wrong." Victor hurled the glass. It shattered against the wall, amber liquid bleeding down white stone. "They're using you," he muttered at the screen. "All of you." But the room did not answer. At noon, Eleanor faced the cameras. She stood alone this time, no corporate logo behind her, no security at her back. Just a woman with silver hair and a steady voice. "I did not come forward for revenge," she said. "I came forward because silence had become a form of violence." Questions flew, about the slap, about Victor, about her past. She answered what mattered. "Yes, he struck me. No, I did not plan for it. Yes, I knew who he was. And yes," she added, pausing, "I knew who he would show himself to be." A reporter shouted, "Do you forgive him?" Eleanor considered the word. "Forgiveness," she said, "is a private act. Accountability is a public one. Today is about the latter." That evening, as the city glowed gold and then indigo, Eleanor returned to the atrium. It was quiet now. The reflecting pool lay still. The bench where she had waited the day before was empty. She sat anyway. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had passed. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something deeper, a closing. Footsteps echoed. She looked up to see a young woman standing a few paces away, nervous, determined. "Miss Whitaker?" she asked. "I'm Anna. I worked in R&D. I was fired after I raised concerns." Eleanor gestured to the bench. "Sit." Anna did. Her hands trembled. "I just wanted to say, because of you, they called me back. They apologized." Eleanor nodded. "Good." "And," Anna added, voice breaking, "they asked me to lead the new lab." Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. "Then don't waste it. Anna laughed through tears. I won't. When Anna left, Eleanor remained, watching reflections ripple as the building's lights flickered on. Far away, Victor Halle signed his name on yet another document, this one surrendering assets to a trust he no longer controlled. His signature looked unfamiliar to him now, as if it belonged to someone else. He paused, pen hovering. For the first time, there was no deal to be made. No leverage. No threat. Only consequence. He set the pen down. Days turned into weeks. Halcyon changed. Slowly. Painfully. But it changed. Departments were dismantled and rebuilt. Faces once afraid learned to speak. Some executives resigned. Others stayed and learned humility the hard way. Eleanor attended fewer meetings as time passed. She advised, she warned, she reminded. And then, one afternoon, she didn't come at all. Clara found a note on her desk. You have the light now. Don't look for me in the shadows. That evening, Clara stood alone in the atrium, looking out at the city Eleanor had helped shape and reshape. Somewhere, an old woman walked away from glass and steel, her work finally done. And somewhere else, a fallen titan stared at a skyline that no longer bent to his will, understanding at last that power taken without conscience always comes due. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a single moment, when the world decides it will no longer look away.